I remember the exact moment the human walked into advanced theoretical combat logistics. He was smaller than I expected. They all are. I had seen images of humans before, of course. Everyone at the Galactic Interspecies Academy had. When Earth made first contact 6 years ago, their faces were everywhere. On news feeds, in diplomatic broadcasts, in the cautious, carefully worded announcements from the Galactic Council about this strange new species that had somehow survived long enough to build starships. But images did not capture the full effect of a human standing in a doorway, blinking at a room full of alien students who had all stopped talking at once. He carried a worn backpack over one shoulder. His boots had a scuff on the left toe. He looked around the lecture hall with calm, dark eyes, found an empty seat near the back, and sat down without saying a word to anyone. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a paper notebook. Someone laughed. I am not proud to say that I was smiling too. My name is veth. I am Shuvari, four-armed, bioluminescent along the ridge of my shoulders, and trained from birth to process information across multiple streams simultaneously. I was, at the time, considered the top student in my year. I say this not to be impressive, but because it matters for what comes later. It matters that someone like me, educated, decorated, proud of his open mind, made exactly the same mistake as everyone else in that room. We looked at Marcus Venn and saw a species that had not yet caught up to us. Professor Oram called the class to order. He was a veth, ancient, four-eyed, a veteran of 3 actual wars before he became the most decorated combat logistics instructor in the Academy's history. He did not waste words. He pulled up the simulation on the central display and told us what we already knew. The Siege of Korath Station. The most studied battle in the Academy's curriculum. A brutal, grinding engagement from 200 years ago, in which a small garrison held a strategic supply station against an overwhelming enemy fleet for 19 days before ultimately losing the station. The historical record was complete. The tactical analysis had been done thousands of times. The accepted optimal response, a phased retreat and flank maneuver that preserved the most lives, was practically memorized by every student in the room before they ever walked through the Academy's doors. We were going to run it as a live simulation. We had all done simulations like this before. The goal was not to find a new answer. The goal was to demonstrate clean execution of established theory. Professor Oram asked if anyone had initial observations before we began. Marcus raised his hand. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but I felt it. The particular quality of attention that a room gives something it finds slightly ridiculous. A Valari girl near the front turned around in her seat. My classmate Drethax, who sat beside me and had never once in 3 years missed an opportunity to be unpleasant, leaned back with the expression of someone settling in for entertainment. Marcus stood. He mispronounced the battle's name. It came out flat and slightly wrong in galactic standard, the way human mouths sometimes struggled with our vowel clusters. Someone near the front giggled. I said nothing. I told myself it was because I was being polite. I know now that I was simply too comfortable to bother. Marcus did not seem to notice, or if he did, he chose not to show it. He looked at Professor Oram and asked, in a steady, quiet voice, whether he could clarify something. He wanted to know about the Korath garrison's supply manifests. Specifically, whether the figures in the historical record were the actual figures, or the figures that had been reported to command. The room went quiet for a different reason then. Not mockery, just confusion. Professor Oram looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that to his knowledge, the historical record only contained the reported figures. The actual manifests, if they ever existed in a different form, had never been recovered or cross-referenced. Marcus nodded. He wrote something in his paper notebook, then he sat down. Drethax whispered to me that the human had just wasted everyone's time asking about something that had no bearing on the simulation. I nodded along. The simulation began. For the first 10 minutes, I was not watching Marcus. I was running my own scenario, executing the retreat and flank with the small variations I had prepared, confident in my approach. I had run this simulation in practice 3 times. My best result had been 29% casualties. I was aiming for 27. Then I noticed that the students around me were no longer looking at their own displays. They were looking at the shared observation feed, specifically at Marcus's simulation. I looked too. and I felt something that I had not felt in a classroom in a very long time. I felt uncertain. Marcus had not executed the retreat and flank. He had not executed any of the known variations. His garrison was holding the line at a position that every tactical model in the Academy's database marked as indefensible, for reasons that were immediately obvious to anyone who had studied the battle. The enemy's firepower concentrated on that side of the station. You did not hold there. You retreated, regrouped, and flanked. Everyone knew this. And yet something was happening on the eastern corridor of his simulation that I could not immediately explain. I ran the numbers. The enemy's supply chain, their eastern resupply route, was experiencing a bottleneck. It was subtle at first. Then it became impossible to ignore. The enemy fleet, which in every historical account and every simulation I had ever seen, maintained steady pressure through day 4 of the siege, was slowing down on Marcus's eastern flank. Not because of any direct engagement, because of a ripple effect from the position Marcus's garrison was holding, a position that, I now realized, was not indefensible at all, but was instead the only position that created pressure on that specific corridor. It was not in any of our models. It had never appeared in any analysis of this battle that I had ever read. It existed because Marcus had chosen to hold a position that no one had ever held, for reasons that none of us had yet understood. I put down my own controls. I was no longer running my simulation. I was watching his. By the time Professor Orim called time, the room was completely silent. Every student had stopped their own work. Even the Valari girl who had laughed at the beginning was leaning forward in her seat, her large eyes moving across the shared display with an expression I recognized because I felt it myself. We were watching something we had not expected to see. Marcus's final casualty count appeared on the display, 11%. Nobody spoke. 11% was not a number that existed in the context of the siege of Korath. The accepted optimal result, the result that had stood for 200 years of academic study, was 34%. My personal best was 29. The Academy record, held by a Dreth student 12 years ago, was 26. 11% was not an improvement on the existing answer. It was a different answer entirely. It suggested that for 200 years, everyone had been solving a slightly wrong version of the problem. Professor Orim asked Marcus to explain his methodology. Marcus stood again. He spoke clearly, and without hurry, in the same quiet voice he had used before. He explained that when he first looked at the historical record, he had noticed that the garrison's behavior in the final days of the siege did not match the behavior of a force that was trying to survive. Specifically, their supply consumption in the last week was inconsistent with a prolonged defense. They were not rationing. They were burning through reserves in a pattern that made no sense if their goal was to hold out as long as possible. That was why he had asked about the supply manifests. He believed the reported figures had been altered, not out of dishonesty, but because the garrison commander had falsified them deliberately to mislead enemy intelligence about how long they could hold out. The actual supply situation was worse than reported, which meant the garrison already knew, from approximately day 4, that they were not going to keep the station. So Marcus had asked himself a different question. Not how do you survive this siege, but rather, if you already know you are going to lose, what are you actually trying to do? The answer, once he looked at the broader strategic map of that period, was that the garrison had been buying time for a friendly fleet that was 14 days out, not trying to hold the station. Trying to keep the enemy fleet occupied and anchored in place long enough for reinforcements to arrive, reinforcements that, in the actual historical event, arrived 2 days too late. Every decision the garrison made, which historians had recorded as desperate and increasingly irrational, was in fact entirely logical under that framework. They were not fighting to win the siege. They were fighting to lose it, slowly, in the right direction, for exactly the right number of days. Marcus had built his simulation around that intent, and then he had found the one defensive position that achieved it most efficiently, the position that nobody held, because nobody had ever understood why you would. By the time he finished speaking, I was no longer thinking about the simulation. I was thinking about every assumption I had carried into that room. I had studied humanity, the way most galactic citizens study humanity, as a footnote, as a curiosity. A species of moderate biological capability, no exceptional sensory gifts, no hive intelligence, No bioluminescence, no natural armor, no particular speed. What they had, we told ourselves, was stubbornness and a high tolerance for chaos. They had survived on their planet through sheer, grinding persistence. It was admirable in a limited way, the way that the endurance of any simple organism is admirable. I had never once considered that 10,000 years of surviving on a dangerous planet, surrounded by things that wanted to kill them, with limited resources and no natural advantages, might produce something more interesting than stubbornness. I had never considered that it might produce people who were extraordinarily good at questioning the problem itself, because for most of their history, accepting the problem as stated was a reliable way to die. They could not afford to assume the situation was what it appeared to be. They never could. It was built into them, by every predator, every famine, every winter, every war that had tried to end them and failed. And I, with my 4 arms and my perfect memory, and my 17 simultaneous data streams, had looked at Marcus Venn's paper notebook and laughed. Professor Orim closed his display. He stood for a moment in the particular stillness that I had learned, over 3 years, meant he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said that in 40 years of teaching this course, no student had achieved below 28% casualties on the Korath simulation. He told Marcus that he would write his methodology as a formal paper. It would be submitted for review by the Academy's historical archive. Then he moved on to the next item on the syllabus. No applause, no ceremony, just fact, acknowledged and recorded, the way Professor Orim did everything. The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. I found Marcus after class. He was sitting on a bench in the corridor outside the lecture hall, eating something from a crinkled silver wrapper, some earth food he had brought from home, and reviewing his notes. He looked up when I approached, and I saw something in his expression that I had not expected. He looked a little surprised that I was talking to him. It occurred to me, for the first time, that he had spent the entire day being laughed at, that he had sat in the back of that room alone, with a paper notebook, while every student around him, including me, had made their low opinion of him very clear, and he had simply continued doing his work. I asked him how he had known to question the supply manifests. He thought about it for a moment, not performing thought, the way students sometimes do when they want to appear deep, actually thinking, the way a person does when they want to give you an honest answer. Then he said that his grandmother used to tell him something when he was young. Whenever something does not add up, she said, do not fix your math, fix your question. He offered me a piece of whatever he was eating. I accepted it. It was sweet and slightly salty, in a combination that should not have worked, and somehow did. I walked back to my dormitory that evening thinking about a grandmother on a small blue planet who had never heard of the Galactic Interspecies Academy, who had never studied combat logistics, who had never looked at a star map in her life, and who had given her grandson the single most important piece of strategic advice that any student in that building had ever received. They say humanity is a young species. 6 years since first contact, still learning to navigate galactic politics, still pronouncing our words slightly wrong, still showing up to prestigious institutions with worn backpacks and paper notebooks. The galaxy looks at them with patience and amusement, the way you look at something that has not yet grown into itself. That evening, I pulled up the Korath simulation on my own terminal. I ran it again, this time starting with Marcus's question. Not how do you survive, but what do you actually want? My casualty count came in at 13%. I sat with that number for a long time. The room had fallen silent, because we had all done the same thing. We had looked at Marcus Venn, and measured him against what we expected. And when he did not match our expectations, we decided the fault was his. We did not consider that our expectations were the problem. We did not consider that a species shaped by that much difficulty, over that many years, might have developed a way of thinking that our comfortable, well-resourced minds had never needed to grow. We did not consider that he was not behind us. We did not consider that he had simply been waiting, quietly, in the back of the room, for someone to ask the right question.